Welcome to tonight's United Front Radio. I'm Daniela Walls, National Chair of the Tax Wall Street Party, with Kyle McCarthy, founding member of the United Front Against Austerity. Tonight we are joined by Emily Weber from the Tax Wall Street Party Chicago local, who is on the ground reporting on the Chuy Rahm Emanuel contest. Huy Garcia has no economic program. He looked clueless in the first and second debate with Rahm Emanuel. Chuy must campaign on the Chicago Teachers Union demand for a LaSalle Street Tax on derivatives and confront Rahm in both the March 26th and March 31st debates. The Tax Wall Street Party and the United Front Against Austerity are announcing that TWSP organizers will be present at each of the two remaining debates between Wall Street Democrat Rahm Emanuel and insurgent Huy Garcia. The Tax Wall Street Party intends to take full advantage of the concentrated media attention at each of these debates, coming on the scene to call attention to the absolute necessity for Huy Garcia to rapidly recast his campaign around the overriding strategic issue of the LaSalle Street Tax, which is a fee on derivatives transactions, which would solve the Illinois, Cook County, and City of Chicago fiscal impasse. It is expected that each of these debates will be marked by the presence of the supporters of each of these candidates, plus the local, state, and even some national media. So this is the place to be. Being present at these two debates is the irreducible minimum to be taken seriously in the current Chicago political situation. The Tax Wall Street Party is mobilizing all of their social media to build an attendance. Once these two events have been successfully covered, we will then go on to additional public interventions.
Emily, you have been involved in the mayoral politics this year, and so why don't you just give us a bit of a background on how you got involved in this and what is going on right now in this race?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Honestly, my interest in the Chicago politics started 2 years ago with the Chicago Teachers Union strike. I mean, the strike was just fantastic. You know, it was exciting to watch everywhere across the nation. And I moved to Chicago early this fall, and the city has just been in an upheaval regarding the debate and regarding the mayoral campaign ever since then. Karen Lewis led the Chicago Teachers Union strike successfully, and the city really rallied around her during that time. And then she was planning on running for mayor in the summer. Tragically, something happened. She wasn't able to run. And so now Jesus Chuy Garcia is kind of her stand-in. And so the Chuy campaign has been running since the fall. And I hadn't been very much involved until quite recently when they had the election early February. Much to everyone's surprise, Rahm Emanuel did not just win. He was forced into a runoff. And so now we have this very exciting period of a few weeks where the future of the city of Chicago is hanging in balance.
And let's back up a little bit just to remind everybody what the Chicago teachers strike was about and why public education is such an important issue in this whole election, with the Chicago Teachers Union really figuring in terms of who they're endorsing and supporting in the race. I mean, do you want to talk about that, the whole issue with the pensions and charter schools?
Really, the issue sits in this larger trend of private companies, startups sort of taking over areas that are typically seen and held by public organizations. So you have the public schools in Chicago, and you have a board of education. And the Board of Education in Chicago, unfortunately, is appointed by the mayor. It is not an elected Board of Education. And what's been happening over the past few years is many of the schools in Chicago have been closed. The student population in the Chicago public schools is 40% African American, but all of the school closings have been schools that are 97% Black and not, some kind of small margin. So all of the schools that have been closed have been African American students. The schools have been closed largely to make way for largely white schools to move in.
Where did the Black students go?
They have been forced to move to other schools. So rather than going to their neighborhood school, they've been forced to walk extremely long distances or take the public bus, which doesn't sound so bad, except that they've had to go across territories that are extremely violent, like traditionally known as gang territories. And in fact, it was so bad that when this first happened, I think the city stationed individual people to act as guards for the students. And some of those guards got harassed. They got attacked on the first couple days. So these are very dangerous territories that these children have to walk through. The schools that the children go to are not integrated schools. They're not wealthy schools. They're all very low income, very segregated schools that are just not high quality.
I understand.
In a lot of the charter school movement, Emanuel is a big supporter, but I think also has a vested interest in this. And also the former, was Arnie Duncan the head of, I'm sorry, I'm spacing on what his role was exactly, but the guy who became Obama's education secretary was the big promoter of charter schools in Chicago, kind of like that Michelle Rhee in Washington, D.C., and so there's this cabal that has come in under the Emanuel administration to push this whole charter concept and redistricting. And
very much so. And one particular instance that's kind of coming out right now is the Magic Johnson scandal, where apparently, basketball player Magic Johnson got some kind of deal with Rahm Emanuel where I think it was a $250 million school deal that was signed recently, and then it just came to the news that Magic Johnson donated, I think it was $80,000 to the Rahm Emanuel campaign, and this is just recently coming out.
And they'll show you the success stories, which would be Walter Payton School, which is like this high-tech charter school in a nice neighborhood up in River North. But for every Walter Payton, there are these sort of forgotten, like what you were describing before, non-integrated schools down on the south side, and it's basically just a matter of budget cutting, increasing the class size, decreasing the quality of education, and just really disrupting the whole structure of the neighborhoods to save money.
Very much so.
Arnie Duncan was the chief executive officer of Chicago public school system. And then he went with Obama, because Obama was from Chicago, and he must have worked closely with Arnie Duncan. Then he became the United States Secretary of Education. So He's our current United States Secretary of Education.
And in Chicago, the big issue has been the teacher pensions. We're basically saying they are, the funding doesn't reach out far enough into the future, and therefore they are quote-unquote bankrupt. And so the fight is kind of over, are we going to cut our pension obligations? Are we going to cut the benefits owed to incoming teachers and so forth? And I think that was when Karen Lewis came onto the scene, was fighting back against that agenda of Rahm Emanuel and Arnie Duncan and the others to basically undermine the future of public schools in Chicago.
Yes, that's true. But also, equally importantly, the Chicago Teachers Union strike took on more issues than even just teacher pay, pensions for teachers. They were advocating for arts in the schools, for music in the schools, for more gym class, for smaller class sizes, for more funding for the school programs. It really became kind of a moment where many, many different groups in the city were rallying around public education in the face of private takeover, essentially. And so the strike was much more than just, one industry advocating for its own interests, even though that's great and needs to be done. But it was considerably more than that. The strike had 70% approval rates among parents in Chicago and had 90% approval rates among the members of the union. And one reason why this was such an amazing thing to watch was that earlier, I think just a few years earlier, Republicans had recently passed in the state of Illinois a mandate that unions could only strike if they had very, very high approval rates within the union. And once this got passed, Republicans thought, this is the end of union strikes in Illinois. This was a victory for them. So for the Chicago Teachers Union, not only to pass that bar, but to leap over it, with such high approval ratings was just really remarkable. It was just a sign of solidarity existing in the city. And so it's really that fight that was started by Karen Lewis that is being battled over right now.
Jesus Chuy Garcia forced Emanuel into a runoff where Emanuel didn't have an overwhelming majority in the primary, so now it's a head-to-head race. Chuy is sort of a substitute for Karen Lewis because she was forced to drop out of the race for personal reasons. Tell us what you can say about Chuy, the good, the bad, and the maybe hopeful signs of where he's trying to take his campaign.
Jesus Chuy Garcia is really a wonderful soul. He's a man who's devoted his whole life to working diligently on community projects in Chicago. He was a part of the historic Harold Washington campaign. And Harold Washington is really a figure in Chicago. He was the first black mayor, and his takeover is something that people love and remember very deeply. He's very much connected to the central nervous system of the city, if you will. Chuy Garcia worked on the Harold Washington campaign, and ever since then he's consistently represented the rights of marginalized people, the rights of poor people, working people, public interest. Just consistently, that's been the kind of central goal of his campaign. You know what you're getting when you vote for Chuy Garcia. He's not going to lie. He's not going to break his promises. He's not going to, cut some deal with somebody and then leave you out in the cold. He's kind of characterized as the neighborhood guy, which I think really actually doesn't kind of speak to some of his tremendous qualities. He's very successful, has a long career, doing a number of things in the state of Illinois, the city of Chicago. He knows this place very well. It's really just...
I worry that while he might be a neighborhood guy, he's not going to be a strong enough fighter to come out in favor of a financial transaction tax, the LaSalle Street Tax, on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is what his base of support, the unions, are demanding. And Karen Lewis, who put him in charge of her campaign when she got sick, asked him, will you support the LaSalle Street Tax? He said yes, but I haven't heard him come out for it yet, so that concerns me. While he might be a good soul and a neighborhood guy, I worry he's going to back down when it comes to the financial transaction tax, specifically calling for a LaSalle Street Tax. I mean, is he a fighter? Is he a good mob orator? The way this is going to go down is that it's going to have to be passed through Chicago or Cook County. Then a judge is probably going to strike it down. Does he have the conviction to call for a mass strike to surround the courthouse when the judge strikes it down and get all the unions out to protest it and keep pushing this through? Is he even going to mention it by name in any of the debates? A lot of these things concern me.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Emily, but just having been in and around Chicago for a while, it's, this is not a real activist politician culture. It's the mayor has a very strong position, but even more so maybe, I would say the Speaker of the Illinois House of Representatives, Mike Madigan, probably is stronger in terms of his power base than even the governor. Mayor Daley had a lot of power when he was in, but it's not even so much that there's a crony culture as there are these power blocks, and you can't just come, people don't really come and go. They stay for a long time. So I think from the statement I read by the Garcia campaign saying, he supports in principle Wall Street sales tax, but kind of shied away from the LaSalle tax. I think it's being a pragmatic politician about how Chicago actually works, and that you can't just, by force of will make things happen, because the interests here are very entrenched.
Well, I always think you can get a lot done by force of will. He can call for it in Chicago. It's not going to pass in Washington. It has to come through Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, all I can really kind of refer to that is I know his campaign manager Clem is under the opinion that basically first they would need to get into office and then they'd need to kind of take over city council, which Clem thinks they can do in a couple years. And then as far as how they would...
Yeah, but it's seeming more and more that he's not even going to get elected unless he mentions the LaSalle Street Tax. His polls are going down.
I mean, say Chuy actually does get elected, like, what we would do after that, if we're, like, consistently this independent organization that's, like, pushing democratic governance, which is probably a really good model, then they might, like, need to rely on outside pressure, like, agitating them towards that, and that might be, like, how anything gets done. I mean, I'd almost be inclined to say that if we can, like, take over the city, then, like, the popular pressure is just, like, so overwhelming, then, like, people have to start responding.
What's motivating my question is what I see as the difference between Karen Lewis, who appeared to me to be a fighter for the LaSalle Street Tax, and Chuy, who I feel is pulling away from it, and watching the poll numbers go down, and Rahm cornering him and saying, how are you going to pay for what you want to do? And when he doesn't have an answer, he looks weak, and his polls go down. It's seeming more and more that he's got to mention the LaSalle Street Tax by name, or at least, at minimum, just pay it lip service and talk about a financial transaction tax. Today, the Chuy campaign came out and said, this needs to go through Washington, like I said, which is a cop-out, because it being in Washington, this isn't going to pass in Washington. I mean, it's going to have to go through the Republican House, and then Obama's going to strike it down because he's a Wall Street puppet. So, it doesn't need to be done in Washington the way we have a financial transaction tax on the books in New York. That was done through the mayor and governor. It can be done in any locale. It can be done at the city, state level. I'm just wondering if he's the same type as Karen Lewis to come in and this is going to happen in a revolutionary mass, as a revolutionary mass strike, meaning somebody's going to bring it up and then somebody's going to be in office and say, I'm pushing for this. This is really explain to the public what something like the LaSalle Street Tax is, and then say, the judge struck it down, get out on the street, and then you'll see progress. I think this is going to have to go down. And my fear is that Chuy wouldn't be that fighter. That's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't, it's that seems like that probably would be the case, for a couple reasons. I mean, maybe if Karen were kind of pushing him a little bit more, if the CTU were pushing him a little bit more, he'd kind of be more aggressive in terms of, like, activist policy. But I really don't know what he would do.
And it also goes to show you, though, that you need some kind of a third force to intervene. Webster Tarpley talks about this during the New Deal, where it was the labor movement who was forcing FDR into certain positions. And I think in this case, too, you can't expect a mayor to come in and build a mass strike movement. You need a mayor who's amenable to that, but you need then the mass strike movement, which in this case would be led by groups like the Chicago Teachers Union, the Nurses Union, just groups on the street who are going to hold their aldermen's feet to the fire and the city council members' feet to the, you can't, and a president has more executive power than a mayor in this kind of a situation does. So it's really, you need to get Chuy Garcia elected because you know exactly what Emanuel is going to do, and there's no possibility of change.
So the formula is, without a doubt, we want to fight to get Chuy in, and then organizations like ours, Tax Wall Street Party, is going to have to come in and be a pressure group on the unions and work with the unions to pressure the Chuy office.
Yeah, I think so.
So that's the formula here. We're not going to be so lucky as to have Karen Lewis come in and say, all right, troops, get out on the street. We're going to demand the LaSalle Street Tax. So it's a different formula.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know how well Karen is after her surgery. Like, I mean, she really did have very serious brain surgery. And when I saw her speak in public in early February, it was it was really pretty shocking. I mean, she's still like very much in rehab. I mean, if she were less in rehab, then I think she'd be like, if she were feeling well, you know, and if she like had her mind back, then she'd be like a lot more aggressive in stomping for Chuy, in making sure that the African American vote does not go to Rahm Emanuel. But she's just like basically off the playing field at this point. And I think the campaign's really suffering for it.
People, if you told people we want to put in a Wall Street sales tax on financial transactions, where would you think most people would think that would be most effective, geographically speaking? Wall Street, probably. But it turns out that Chicago is actually the world center of derivatives trading. And just to give you an example, so Chicago has the CME, which is the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and that owns the Mercantile Exchange, the Chicago Board of Trade, the New York Mercantile Exchange, the Kansas City Mercantile Exchange, Board of Trade, and some other stuff. It's got the Chicago Stock Exchange, the Chicago Board Options Exchange, and then it has any number of hedge funds and also headquarters of some banks and stuff. I've heard Rahm Emanuel denigrate this idea of the LaSalle Street Tax by saying, there's nothing left on LaSalle Street, because he's talking about, commercial savings and loan banks. But what there is the whole derivatives industry.
Say that silly formula in New York too. There's nothing left on Wall Street. They've all moved up to Madison Avenue. It's not it's the name of the street is just a term for with a system.
I just wanted to throw out one number, and the Chicago Stock Exchange, which I think is the number 2 stock exchange in the country, the total notional volume of trading, the value of assets traded back and forth on the Chicago Stock Exchange, is about $65 billion a year. The total value of assets traded in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange is $1,000 trillion a year. So compare the two of those, and you can start to see, the Mercantile Exchange is, what would that be? It's about 10,000 times bigger than the stock exchange. And the reason being is that is where derivatives are traded. So a derivative would either be a future, an option, or a swap. And these are just, think of them as insurance policies. You're sort of betting something is going to be worth more than some target price in the future, worth less, and then there are just different ways of finagling it. And so they trade everything from agricultural commodities to currencies to things like credit default swaps to all kinds of bets on bets, and flash trade them back and forth at the speed of light all day, every day, until, the point where people have questioned us, saying that's impossible. It can't be in the quadrillions of dollars a year traded in derivatives. You can go to the CME's own annual reports, and they're going to tell you that it's a quadrillion dollars a year just at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange in Chicago.
Jeez.
So how does the fact that this is $1 per trade, unlike what we're asking 1%?
Let's separate this for a second, the discussion of, what should be called for at the level of Chicago. If you're just talking about a federal tax, a lot of this is going to affect things going through the Mercantile Exchange. And remember, these are not all Chicago companies. This is where I think that what I read was that 20% of their trading is open outcry, which is, guys on the floor in jackets screaming at each other. And then 80% is all computerized. And so it's hedge funds, banks around the world, all just trading through the CME terminals. But if you're just looking at the federal level, we want a 1% tax, and then someone else says we'll make it $1 per trade. $1 is 1% of $100. So what do you think the average value of a trade on the CME is, more or less than $100? It's going to be in the thousands and thousands.
The average trade coming out of Chicago is $333,333. So do the math. 1% versus $1.
These guys are not, it's not like they're buying a stock. They're buying like huge baskets of stocks, or they're buying, they're making big trades all day long back and forth. They're trading like their entire portfolio back and forth, which is it could be millions of dollars involved in a single trade. And so if you want $1, well, then that's going to be a lot less than 1% of this huge volume. And so it's kind of two strategies. The dollar per trade strategy would be, let this thing keep functioning exactly as it is, and we just want $1 to drop out every time something crosses the terminal. And the 1% would be, we want more of that money, and we also want to slow this trading down so we can get a hold of it and basically stop it from happening and push financial portfolios out into investment world and take them out of the speculation world. So I guess this becomes kind of a debate. And then, then we need to look at, if you are Chuy Garcia, do you call for a 1% sales tax on $2 quadrillion all going to Chicago? No, I mean, that would be insane. You could do that if you're the president of the United States. But I think that's why we need to be kind of flexible with this, because at the level of the city, I think it's reasonable to ask for a more reasonable amount of money that reflects sort of the tax revenue that's not coming out of this huge physical location that's situated in your city. Does that make sense?
Yes, that made perfect sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like these hedge funds that are in Chicago, they'll publish these statistics on their website, but even to get an account with a hedge fund will basically, they all have a certain type of trading strategy. Like in my professional life, I actually just was forced to do some work for a hedge fund, had to learn a little bit about exactly what it is they do. And this particular place had what's called a liquid alternative, where they're betting on a certain level of volatility in the market. And so they'll take all of these different positions that say, okay, we're going to say it doesn't go above or below this threshold. And if it stays within the threshold, we make money from the people who bet that it's going to go beyond the threshold. They take basically a bunch of big money investors, and to get into this thing at all, you have to be putting like tens of millions of dollars. So they don't deal with small people. They deal with someone who's willing to give you $10 million to bet that the stock market is going to stay within a certain range of fluctuation. And so it's just crazy stuff like that. It's just pure speculation on assets that they don't ever intend to own. Well, and look at the big threat that's floated by Rahm Emanuel, who's out there saying, oh, what does this guy want to do? Kill the whole financial industry in Chicago? Yeah, kill it. Kill it dead, because look at what, we were just talking about. Somebody comes in and has $10 million in their personal portfolio to just bet on a range of fluctuation in the futures market or something like that, but they can't take that $10 million and start a business. It's crazy. This is where the money in this country has gone. It's all been siphoned up to the top to these people that have no idea what to do with it other than try to play games to try to make more money. And meanwhile, nobody's building the railroad system that needs to be rebuilt in Chicago. On and on and on. We need the money to flow back down toward the bottom.
Seeing you go to work, Kyle, on that Metra, and then when you talk about the amount of money that's traded through Chicago. That's such a dissonance with that. Like, I was thinking, do the stockbrokers travel to the CME on the Metra?
Oh, no.
They don't?
Well, maybe the brokers do, but not the big hedge fund guys, I'm sure, are driving down there in their Mercedes or what. I sent Daniela a picture on my cell phone from the Metro, which is the train that goes between Chicago and the suburbs, and she says, "Are you in Bulgaria?" Yeah, Emily, can you talk about, you had some ideas about the transit system and some things you were going to try to impress on Chuy's campaign. Can you sort of talk about your thoughts with all of that? Yeah,
so the plan I proposed was kind of a 1-2 punch. So the first part is the LaSalle Street Tax, which generates tremendous amount of revenue right away. And then the second is where you have the city essentially bidding out contracts to private companies, and the private companies will essentially invest a lot of money into the South Side in a large kind of great public work infrastructure program. So the idea is you essentially rebuild all of the public transit so that it's high speed, efficient, clean, quiet, nice, good quality, and then you make it considerably larger. It shouldn't have to take you an hour and a half to go from the south side of Chicago up to O'Hare Airport. That should take 20 minutes, not 90 minutes. And then after that, you build areas of a lot of transportation and a lot of movement in the south side of Chicago to essentially get more people walking through there, get more businesses walking through, get more commerce. And you do that with the money that you generate from the LaSalle Street Tax. And so, to people who say that, we can't have the LaSalle Street Tax because businesses will move out, then the response is no, we will make Chicago so enticing by networking the city inside of itself and also by connecting the city to other cities across the country by building these massive high-speed trains. So we'll get these maglev trains, from Chicago to New York City in 2 hours, and that will boost our employment, that will make the city this hotspot of public transit, this hotspot of, people moving through, ideas moving through, businesses moving through. And then, frankly, the financiers, they won't want to leave. The city will just be so the place to be.
So they're making that threat in Chicago because that's been the threat they've been making for the last 100 years in New York City. If you do anything to us, we'll leave. But when they were taxed, the tax that ended in the 70s, they never left. They're never going to leave. Like we talked about that on the phone when we were strategizing how to get to the Chuy campaign. They always say those two things. The two things, they're going to leave. And what's the other one they always say? Those babies, Kyle? They have two threats. I think is it just the world's going to come to an end?
Yeah, well, and they're going to leave. Move. They're going to move. Maybe makes sense if you're in Manhattan. You could move to Newark or something. But what are you going to do? Move to Gary, Indiana? Take all of these gigantic buildings in the electronic infrastructure, and it's just not going to happen. The whole point is you have got to slow this whole thing down. So you raise revenue, you protect the real economy from being destroyed by wild financial panics, and you also force money back into the real economy.
What is the threat that they keep making? How is that going to affect us if they move from Wall Street to Newark or Wall Street to Connecticut, or if they move to Gary, Indiana? Yeah, I know I know the basic argument is the revenue for the city and they pay more taxes than everybody else, but other business will come in. I don't understand why
there is no tax. They're telling us on one hand that they can't pay tax because then they'll move and we won't have any tax. Well, you just told us they don't pay any taxes.
Exactly. That's what I was trying to say. That's what I was trying to say. Why are we so afraid? Why is that a threat? That doesn't make any sense to me. And if they did move, then somebody would take the New York Stock Exchange and turn it into a nightclub. And that would generate more jobs and more revenue for the average person. I'm just saying. I'm not trying to be funny, but you can see that, right?
Yeah.
They don't pay taxes, and they hide their incomes in portfolios. I don't know. And the rest of us are relegated to being service workers at minimum wage to serve these people. Bye-bye, somebody else will create jobs that are not being a waitress or a masseuse or a dry cleaner for these people.
It's a net drain on the economy, and then the real problem is just it creates this vested political power that stops you from doing positive things like, nationalizing the Federal Reserve so you can build this train system. Or it's such a huge albatross around our neck.
And the thing is what would it mean for the average person if Wall Street evaporated tomorrow? Explain that for the audience, because you're the best person to explain that, Kyle.
Well, there are real things in Wall Street, meaning people's pension funds. Real savings have been invested in this market. So you don't want the whole thing to just evaporate tomorrow. You want an orderly dissolution of this sort of uncontrolled speculation and a move into whatever. It's if you've got the Federal Reserve, then all of a sudden like Treasury bonds become really valuable, and you can start to move things like the Chicago. Why is the speaking of the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, you could go do some searching on the internet. There are these things that people talk about a lot called what is that? What's the thing that Walter Berian guy talks about? Comprehensive Annual Financial Reports. So you could go look up the CAFR for the Chicago Teachers Union, and you will probably find that at some point right around 2008, 9, 10, that all of the pension funds were invested in credit default swaps and in stuff like that. So it's really, you've got this real money that's invested in a sewer. And rather than that real money should also be invested in job creation and in building trains and increasing the value of Chicago so that over time you're getting your money back and you're also making it more affordable and more enjoyable to live in the city and all this kind of stuff. You don't want Wall Street, quote unquote, to just disappear tomorrow, because then everyone's going to lose their retirement, but you need to unwind it and rewind it in something productive and move away from a system based on money and move into a system based on credit and investment.
When I watched the Chuy Rahm Emanuel debate, the first one that was a debacle and an embarrassment for Chuy because he didn't have a financial program, they were debating the $100 million from the red light stoplights.
Stoplights are like a really contentious issue. People are really upset about the stoplights, even though there's...
Why? That's what I'm trying to figure out. The money it's going to give back is what, $70 or $100 million?
I mean, I don't know why people are upset about it, but they are. Even though it's not as much money, as like the LaSalle Street Tax would be, mm-hmm. It's kind of enough, and people know about it enough, and they're upset about it that it's like kind of an issue. But as far as a solid economic solution, it really does not compare.
Well, we were talking the other night that the LaSalle Street Tax would yield like $20 billion. And the topic that's getting people's backs up is it's 70 million or something.
Yeah.
It makes me nuts when people get distracted in these sand traps.
It's the same thing as wedge issues like that. The red light cameras are in your face because there's a robot giving you a ticket for $100. But you're not seeing the drain on your earning potential represented by, all this trading happening downtown. You're not seeing what that does to your salary or your wage or your real estate tax. What you do see is that you got a ticket in the mail.
Exactly. And that was the point that I was exactly trying to get to. How do we get people to see it? How does it become tangible and understandable for people? Like the people I talk to who aren't angry about the amount of money extracted by Wall Street, it's because they can't see it. You see what I mean? Like, how do we make that as tangible as the red stoplights, the red light cameras?
What are the other taxes? Because, the whole issue is okay, if we have to pay to, shore up these municipal pensions, what are the revenue sources? And Rahm Emanuel says, number one, we want to expand the city sales tax onto service businesses like, ad agencies and lawyers and accountants and stuff. Number two, build a casino, because that's always a great idea. He has a couple other like that are, raise property taxes.
Right.
And so it's all regressive taxes that hit the middle class and even, with the casino that basically just rake the desperate poor over the coals to try to...
Those are the exact same list of regressive taxes that they implemented in New York when they started refunding the $20 billion to Wall Street. They have a casino in Manhattan now.
Right.
All the property taxes went up. And the subway fare... Do you know I read an article yesterday? When I left New York City a few years ago, the subway fare, if you live in New York City, I don't know if it's the same in Chicago, but you take the subway multiple times a day, the average person. It's like you're on and off subways all day long. Each fare when I left was $1.50, and I found that a little bit cumbersome. Every time I have to walk down the stairs to get on the subway to go 2 stops, I have to pay another $1.50. It's up to $2.75 now. Well, it's up to $2.50, but there was a big scandal because de Blasio is coming in to raising it another quarter to $2.75 per rock.
Emily, what is the L these days? I don't take it anymore.
The L is $2.25, but that includes the bus and the train. And then if you can transfer, so once you get off one of those, you have like, I think a 10-minute window, something like that, where you can just jump on another form of public transit. But I mean, the train does not compare in Chicago to the subway in New York City, not by a long shot. I mean, it doesn't go as many places. It's not as fast. It's not on time. There aren't as many trains. I know it's above ground. It's just like really, it's just not anywhere near as good, even as the one in New York City.
So in New York and Chicago, with Wall Street and the CME there, I'm just trying to think of one issue where it would be like the red light cameras, where people could get out, could feel something tangible to get out on the streets. And I think public transportation has historically been one thing that people have mobilized behind. Historically, Americans have wanted cheap, fast, clean, modern public transportation, and they'll fight for that. And if you said, we're going to give you all the, modernize the public transport, the trains, and make them free, and Wall Street's going to pick up the tab, or the CME is going to pick up the tab, I think that correlation maybe is something to get on the street. And I know this sounds so basic. It's something I wrestle with all the time, because I'm looking at blank faces when you say Wall Street pays no tax. This is what Wall Street does. When I go through all the stuff you described, Kyle, or I hand a flyer, it means nothing. But I see them get so enraged over something they can touch, taste, smell, feel.
I mean, it's like a typical day for me now is I get on a train that was, probably a diesel locomotive built in like the 60s, ride that downtown. I end up like on my way to work. I walk 3 miles because to walk to the L, it would take a mile to get there. And then you would go like all the way around the loop. It would take like a half an hour to get where I'm going. I go to an advertising agency that Rahm Emanuel wants to put a sales tax on, and I design websites for a hedge fund.
If you saw somebody do it that day, and you put it in black and white in Stalin's Russia, you're like, oh, wow, look what they had.
It's like a Jonathan Swift novel.
Yeah, well, what if there were, state-of-the-art transportation and it was free? Zooming all around like a massive spider web there.
Yeah.
And
it may be a good idea to film like a day in the life in Beijing or Shanghai or modern cities that have modern infrastructure. What it's like when you have a real nice public transit in one city and then also across cities. I mean, literally, if there was a high-speed train, which there can and should be, between Chicago to New York City, business would change overnight in both of those cities. Because then suddenly you have you have thousands of people who can go to New York City for the night and come back home in a safe, timely, cheap manner. And so businesses would just go through the roof in both of those cities, like immediately. It would just be so convenient for everybody.
You'd make Minneapolis a suburb of Chicago. Literally, because it would take about, an hour and a half to get there, which is how long it takes to get out to the suburbs now.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, the people I talk to, like, it really seems like this kind of image of, like, what, society should be, what the 21st century will look like. People have it, and they know that, like, it's almost there. But I think they just think that, like, someone else is going to do it, or it will just happen on its own. And I don't think they know that, like, it's something we have to consciously fight for. Like, when Lincoln got the, national trains put in, that was a concerted effort. Like, people were fighting to get the trains set, and we have to fight again.
The middle class, all classes come out to fight for free, cheap, modern transportation. Before they put in the subways in New York, you had people out there in top hats begging for the New York City subway. That's something that everybody can get behind.
Yeah, except for, like, car industries. You know, like
Yeah.
the car lobby and the airplane lobby are really going to fight maglev rails. Like, they will do everything they can to make sure that those rails
But
don't.
we've got to start thinking about mass strike. What's going to get the people making demands, and then you'll see progress. You'll see. I'm telling you, you'll see. We have to tap into something that is going to make the people say, I want this and I want it now. And somehow relate in a simple way that with this with this $1 per trade we could have, and then just one specific thing that they just want, and map out how the new train systems could look and make it free.
Yeah.
You know, getting back to just what is life like in Chicago? I wouldn't say that the public transportation here is just so awful that it's embarrassing, but you know, it could be a lot better, and it's so awful that it's embarrassing if you live on the south side, if you live on the southwest side, if I'm trying to get from the northwest suburbs to Midway Airport, which is down on the south side, that is a long day. I mean, that's going to be probably 3 hours of traveling by train to go 30 miles.
Yeah,
Something
it's terrible.
like that.
I mean, it takes an hour and a half to go from the south side up to Evanston.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have essentially two different towns. I mean, Hyde Park and Evanston are very different places.
How many miles apart are those two places?
Maybe 20 miles.
Huh.
Maybe could be less. I don't know.
Yeah.
I didn't know if it was like a couple miles away or an hour. I didn't know.
Yeah, it's, you know, and so I think a lot more people in Chicago have cars than you would find in New York City. You know, if somebody lives near downtown, they might not need one, maybe, but like, it's not it's not as train friendly, and there are a lot of neighborhoods that are kind of no man's land.
But this is a problem everywhere. Manhattan had good subways 100 years ago, and Manhattan's still functioning on the infrastructure from 100 years ago. Nothing's improved.
Mm-hmm.
And in D.C., there's been all these random little explosions and fires where some people have died recently because the wiring is so bad and everything's falling apart in the D.C. subways. And
people die on the Chicago trains all the time. It's
how
like, you know,
Chicago trains.
Oh, on the L, they'll just fall on the tracks and get electrocuted. Or on the, I swear to God. And then on the Metro train, which is kind of like an Amtrak, probably at least once a week someone dies getting hit by a Metro train. Either like a kid crossing the tracks trying to get to school just died yesterday. It'll either be that or a car is trying to cross the tracks. It's, you know, you're talking about like a 70 mile an hour diesel locomotive flying right through a neighborhood. And so even that kind of stuff just...
You have outdoor trains. Okay, I've never experienced that really in a city. Because D.C. they're underground and in New York they're underground.
Yeah, and I mean, then, like Emily was saying, you look in Shanghai where they've got an elevated maglev train that's just gliding across China at 350 miles an hour and unable to hit any pedestrians.
That's right. That's the difference. They're elevated or underground. And when I look at the train that you're traveling to work on, it's like a train that carries cargo. But that was a great idea that Emily had to show what it's like in another civilized country.
I mean, if Americans knew what they were missing out on, they would be pissed. They would be upset. They would be motivated. They would do more to get what they can have. And frankly, if they don't, like, our nation is going to become backwards.
Well, isn't Christian Picoult from the Chicago local in Shanghai?
Yeah.
Can he work on this project? Take some video?
I'll see if I can get him to take some videos. That's a good idea.
Then we can have our film team cut it together. But if he can get some video of what a trip is like, that would be interesting.
I'll film myself getting to Chicago, and Emily will film herself getting to Evanston, and we can show our hair graying in real time.
Nice.
No, seriously, that train you guys have there, it's really, it's like from another planet.
The more general note about transportation, I would say, and I think Emily alluded to this earlier, it's like when Sarah Palin got busted for wanting to build a bridge to nowhere. I'm not trying to defend Sarah Palin, but it's like building a rail line to nowhere. You know, if you extend this maglev rail, it's like, well, why would you, connect Chicago to Cleveland, let's say? Well, as soon as you connect it to Cleveland, then there's a reason to go to Cleveland, because you can get there conveniently. Hold on,
Who uses the idea? Well, where do we hear the idea of the bridge to nowhere? Who made that famous? The Republicans?
Even recently, we had this article getting passed around about, was it in D.C.? I think it was like the Heritage Foundation wrote this big analysis criticizing the idea of building some kind of a light rail system going from one place to another. But it's basically anytime somebody wants to build new transportation infrastructure, someone's right there to call it a boondoggle and say, this is non-economical or it's not going anywhere we need to get to. But again, it's like you build the rail line from the city to even the suburbs, and all of a sudden, well, okay, now I can live in the suburb and have a garden in my yard and still get to the city in time for work. It's the same thing where it's just, why not expand the possibilities and make everywhere you put on a rail line instantly becomes more valuable because you can get there cheaply and quickly.
Like connect D.C. out to Virginia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was looking a few months ago at neighborhoods in D.C., my best friend, my college roommate, said to me, "Oh, well, I don't want you relying on the subway because they keep burning up. Cars have caught on fire. You're trapped down there."
The south side of Chicago is another example. There's, the Red Line just runs pretty much right down the lake from like downtown to, Comiskey Park and beyond, and Hyde Park and all that, which is okay, but then it's like there's a huge triangle between the Red Line and what would it be, the Green Line, I guess, where you can't get anywhere. So
you can't get anywhere, and then the space in between it. I mean, it's essentially like a Wilderland. It's this like gigantic, vast space where like it's not safe to go. People do go there. People live there. People die there. There's like very little, authority. And it's dangerous. Like, it's dangerous for the people who live there. And all of that can be rebuilt. Like, every single person who lives in the south side of Chicago is an asset to the city. But this is not realized by the people who run the city. The people are seen as liabilities. And that's just not true. And so if we rebuild the south side, if the people realize that they're assets, and if the government realizes that they're assets, then suddenly the South Side is this, like, vibrant, moving, lively, wonderful place where people are making a lot of money, they're spending a lot of money, they're learning a bunch of things, they're getting training, they're doing, interesting things with their lives. They're not just getting thrown in jail, because they're trying to make a couple bucks. So frankly, it's, an economic issue, political issue, cultural issue, social issue, and all of it is just because there are no jobs for these people, even though they are themselves assets and they can add so much and do so much, and no one has an answer for them. And so they just, go back to, down the Red Line, and that's just how it goes. Like, their housing is not great, their schools are not great. They essentially have no opportunities, and no one has an answer for them except for like huge, large-scale, massive investments and rebuilding.
Yeah, well, and that's a great point. It's just like, what if you connect Lawndale to jobs in Evanston with a 20-minute train ride? Well, that just sort of changes the whole dynamic instantly. It's just, I think black youth unemployment is something like 75%. Nationally. It might even be worse in Chicago. And it's like, well, why is there this big divide between the north and the south side? You could just look at a map of the CTA and you'll see why. In part, you'll see why, because the whole place is isolated. It's like beyond Thunderdome as soon as you're beyond walking distance from the Red Line, pretty much.
It's really true. And it's a shame. it's not good economic policy. You know, like, if you're going to talk straight economics, then you have to talk like maximizing competition. You know, like, you maximize trades that can be made everywhere. You maximize utility. You don't just like shut off, you know, like 30% of your capacity and then just ignore it. You know, that's just like not good policy, you know, from a strictly economic point of view. You know, so what UFAA and the Tax Wall Street Party has to offer, you know, we're not just giving away free money. You know, this is not some kind of like welfare utopian where people don't have to work. Like, the policy we're trying to advocate definitely requires work. You know, it requires work, it requires competition, it requires innovation, it requires, you know, consistently high standards from everyone. So what we're trying to do right now is, you know, push the government to be more competitive. And then you have to, you know, make the financial sector slightly less of an obstacle so that other sectors can compete more. Because right now they're just sucking away, you know, all the funds. And it doesn't have to be that way, and it shouldn't be that way. I mean, from a purely economic point of view, it's just bad policy.
Very well said. Let's wrap this up. We're running out of time, but Emily, thank you so much for being on. And Daniela is going to do next week's show with Emily and Dan Albanese, who's another member of our Chicago local, and talk about his intervention tonight at a rally for Chuy Garcia, and sort of continue on some of the themes we were talking about here, and hopefully start to talk a little bit more about on-the-ground organizing and, you know, what it's really like to get involved in a direct political struggle like this, and some things that we're learning on the ground. So thank you again.
Emily was at the party tonight, too, for the Chuy campaign. Emily?
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
So we'll report on that when we have Dan, who just got home from that. So we'll do a whole report on the Garcia campaign and where we're at now.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you for being with us, Emily. And I'll see you for Friday. Okay.
Okay.